And new developments today in the Menendez brothers murder case. The extended family of Eric and Lyle are pushing for their release as prosecutors review their 1989 case.
I don't think there's any question in this case that the boys or the young man, one was 19, the other was 21 at the time, that they murdered the parents. I think that's factual. It's been established. I think the questions that are presented to us is two simple questions. One possibility, what is being alleged by his lawyers, not by us, that there was evidence that had that evidence been presented to the jury, the outcome of this case would have been different. And second, under California law, a path to resentencing where a prosecutor can evaluate whether someone has been rehabilitated, and if so, ask the court to determine whether the person should be resentenced.
The Menendez brothers, we have seen this new call to release them 35 years roughly after their conviction. Today on Bets and Badges, we once again speak with Dr. Debbie Goodman, criminologist, professor. Welcome, Debbie. How are you?
Thank you so much, Robert and David. Always a pleasure to join the podcast. And wow, what a case to unpack and discuss.
Definitely. On that note, I am joined by my co-host and colleague, retired police chief and military historian, David Magnusson. How are you, David?
Hey, I'm doing great. Great to see you. And Dr. G, great to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. So let's get right into it. So what's this new evidence that's been brought up, and where does the case stand today?
Yes, well, new evidence potentially is a letter that Eric Menendez wrote to a relative, a cousin of his, which again is alleged to point to allegations of abuse that he endured at the hands of the father. But certainly we would wonder, we, the three of us, and we, the viewers, why was this not brought forward 34 years ago in 1989 when the case took place? And so whether this will or will not be introduced as evidence, that's the talking point or what's being discussed, of course, on social media. And then another consideration is the first-degree murder charge, which is what resulted after trial number one. We know that ended in a mistrial. Trial number two, really the only option, according to jurors that we've heard from and read about through the years, is that they were only given the option of first-degree murder. There was no manslaughter option. And so now here we are as we discuss this in October of 2024, and potentially there is consideration, according to District Attorney George Gascon, regarding the 34 years that each of whom has served, and is that considered enough time? And does he feel that they should be released now or relatively soon?
There's no doubt as to whether they committed the homicide, right, or homicides. So in 19...
They never denied that either. They never denied that either. Okay.
That is correct. So in 89, the brothers come home, their mother and their father in their TV room or family room. The two brothers execute him or shoot him with shotguns, right, and kill him, right? Multiple rounds, very gruesome scene. The brothers then called the police, claimed that they came home and found their parents dead. Somebody killed them. Immediately, they told the police that the brothers told the police that they believe it was because of the father's ties to some shady people, some, mob type people. So they plant the seed there. What we do know is that the brothers go out on a spending spree shortly after the homicide, and ultimately, the story unravels and they get charged. The case goes to trial in 1993, roughly 4 years after the execution of the parents. What are your thoughts, David? Because as a career law enforcement, I know that we have strong opinions about.
We ultimately know what they use as their excuse, but that flies in the face, at least to me, of how they tried pinning it on somebody else to begin with. and then go spending lavishly, as Robert stated, as opposed to just saying right there, this is what happened, this is why we did it. You wouldn't have needed waiting for a letter to show up to cousin Andy Cano, that comes up miraculously later. So I mean, my thoughts from the onset, you go a lot of times in crimes, you go by the first thing that comes out of somebody's mouth when they're trying to come up with an excuse. And the fact of the matter is, here we are. They're not taking responsibility. I mean, if in fact what they're saying is true with the abuse, and how horrid would that be? And then to take it a step further, to kill the person that was doing it, as well as his wife, your mother. And now you're going to go down the road and say, well, it was somebody else that did it. And if in fact somebody killed your parents, I would probably be a little bit more distraught than going out and spending their money. And I have been around long enough to know that ultimately, when you got facts A and B, somewhere down the road, if those aren't working, miraculously, you come up with facts C and D to try to help your cause.
Yeah. So what we know is that the sexual abuse allegation came up right after the first trial, I believe.
Sure.
Now there's a claim of sexual abuse, right? Lifelong sexual abuse. Andy Cano, the cousin, who now the defense has and the state have, his letter has deceased, so he will not be testifying. But would that have made, if that letter had been introduced in 1993 to the court, would that letter have changed the minds of the jurors? Doctor, what are your thoughts?
I would say perhaps, but I also feel David has presented some interesting points for us to analyze as well. And clearly, both of you, as career law enforcement experts, retired police chief, retired police captain, I agree with the foundation of what somebody tells you at the very onset of the crime is huge in terms of their credibility, their reliability, their responsibility, and the fact that the very first statements from each of whom were complete lies. Now, for somebody like me, the criminologist who's dealing with the mindset, what other lies have been told? So that's the problem that I'm having with this. And yes, Robert, to your point, if some of this had been introduced early on, it may have made a difference, and perhaps a jury may have thought manslaughter was more in keeping. But the reality is, the three of us know, and your viewers are well versed, we know that this was first-degree murder times two, and the elements of which were all present. It was planned, it was premeditated, it was willful, and it was malice. We know they bought the shotguns, we know they bought the ammunition. Now, here potentially is something legal that we might want to consider, and that is something that's actually called in statute imperfect self-defense. So clearly, we understand self-defense if party A feels that party B is potentially going to cause great bodily harm and/or one's life is in jeopardy. So we understand that. But interestingly, the law does have this statute which refers to somebody would be admittedly acting unreasonably, but it does apply to cases where there is severe trauma, where there is PTSD. Perhaps we're more familiar with conditions called battered women syndrome. So if anything, it's almost parallel to that, whereby the individual is simply not thinking and acting clearly at the time in which he or she kills the other party. And some forensic psychologists maintain because of the abuse and the trauma that they have endured. But of course, the question for us today is really and truly, were they or were they not the victims of sexual abuse?
Let me ask you this, doctor, if I may. On the battered women syndrome and the cases that come up, do they normally, the victims or the ones that committed the crime but were victims, right, battered women, do
Yes.
they find somebody else to blame it on by and large, or do they usually say, I did it because of these reasons and I was being battered?
You're right. That's an excellent point, and it's the latter part of your statement. It's that these women primarily, but it could still be men who
Mhm.
would be victims of battery in intimate relations, but historically and primarily women would right then and there admit to the law enforcement representative and take ownership and take responsibility for what has happened, and most likely would explain why. Because perhaps at that moment in time, their life was not in peril. However, due to this building up of over a period of time, considerable time, years, whereby the psyche has changed, the decision making has changed, the emotions, these have been successfully argued in court as viable defenses.
Is this a case of reacting to the mass attention and participation of celebrity stars who have gotten involved and pushed for this case to be, one, reviewed, two, reopened?
They were abused the first 20 years of their life in horrific ways, and they've been imprisoned.
Kim Kardashian, who has used her platform to really talk about criminal justice issues and bring light people who have wrongfully been accused, she just penned an essay for NBC News in which she says that Eric and Lyle Menendez should be resentenced, potentially set free.
You know, I want to thank the millennial culture of all these kids online who said, we learned about this in government class, we learned about this in civics, and how did this happen?
There's certainly politics involved. Is it politically driven? I don't know. I know the DA is in a tough race to keep his job. And
Election,
if you-
right?
Yes.
Re-election.
Re-election. And as far as the other people getting involved, I know one Rosie, the other one Kardashian. I know she did make an appeal to then President Trump on a case, and it worked out for her. And there might have been merit to it, and good for her. Um, um, but it's that the longer you go down the road, the lines get blurred a little bit, it becomes a little bit easier to pick up the cause. And listen, good-hearted people sometimes pick up the wrong cause. I'm not just saying that's the wrong cause, and I'm not condemning that. But all that does create an atmosphere of political. It is, and I don't think it if when people buy into that and it goes down that road. A lot of times the facts, the real facts, sort of get erased a little bit. But again, it goes back to the question of politicizing this. Of course, it's been politicized, but that shouldn't take away that two people were killed, slaughtered. It doesn't matter how long ago. And so with that in mind, we'll see how everything unfolds. I feel very strongly about diminishing the case that two people were slaughtered, and now because of the time that goes on, well, it's okay. They've done their time. I don't buy into that.
I certainly appreciate what David is bringing to the table and the years of experience again that both of you have. So I'm in agreement with. I don't think we would question the DA 34 years ago saying that this is a first-degree murder case times two victims, and as a criminologist, we can also categorize this as the crime of parricide when one kills a parent, and therein lies a whole other dynamic, because let's just look at that for a moment. If the father is the one doing the abuse, right, just hypothetically, if we agree with that potentially, then wherein lies the rationalization, the justification for why kill the mother? I mean, according to what they have stated, allegedly they felt they could not be apart, that the mother would not survive without the father, and that the mother allegedly, according to the brothers, was already depressed and found out that the father was having an affair. But we don't know if any of this is even validated or accurate, or they again just saying what they're saying.
She did attempt suicide in 1987. We know that. Okay. So she was going through some mental distress, but to your point, and sorry to cut you off, but because this is fascinating, but to your point, you're right. I mean, why if they actually said, and I'm asking this as a question because I didn't know this, that she can't be without him, so they're going to kill her?
Right. How does that hold up in court? Who gets to make that decision?
I think they painted it as, or tried to convey, it was along the lines of a mercy killing. But in this particular case, their actions. It wasn't just the actions at the scene of the crime. It was the ones that led up to it and the ones that followed after the incident. I can't remember which one goes around the couch after shooting the mom, literally walks around the couch, points a shotgun at her, and shoots her again as she's there. The father was shot multiple times. We also know something that's been revealed recently. Another fact that we have not spoken about is the Rosselló performer, the young man who was part of Menudo, who has come forth now in his 50s and said that he had been raped by Jose Menendez.
So we go back to 1989, we go back to California. What was in statute was first-degree murder ×2, mistrial on number 1, conviction on number 2, with no parole. So because that was in place, the question that Robert had asked earlier, and we come back to it again, why is there so much interest and attention, and why are we potentially altering the sentence when the sentencing guidelines said exactly what they said in 1989 and nothing has changed? First-degree murder equals life in prison without parole. But I think in part what David said is accurate too, because we do have now some celebrity involvement and input from Miss Kim Kardashian and Miss Rosie O'Donnell. But once again, how and why is that going to, move the needle on this one? And is it enough to alter this outcome? There's so much going on social media, right? That there are people, sorry to date us, but half our age, and all of a sudden there's this renewed interest among very young people who have strong opinion. Well, are they fully aware of all of the facts, or are they jumping on the so-called bandwagon because now it's popular and people are talking about it and everybody wants to be, on the same platform of what 1,000 other people are saying? So I'm still just not 100% convinced, but I appreciate what you're also introducing. This other individual from the music band Menudo, now as an adult, is saying that he too was, was violated. Does that help the Menendez case? Maybe.
Unfortunately, there's many rebels without a cause out there. We've seen it in so many cases. We've seen it, maybe a decade ago with a cop killer. I think it was up in Pennsylvania where everybody jumped on the bandwagon. The Menudo thing's important. I mean, and people come forward with the facts when they're traumatized years later. It doesn't have to be right away. I mean, some people never come forward. Does that bring credence to what the Menendez brothers? To a certain extent, it could.
Well, actually, I wanted to just ask each of you, based on your law enforcement expertise, how would you react and respond when you are potentially interviewing a victim who right out of the box lies? Do you then believe what they tell you next and they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I lied, but I was, so traumatized, I didn't know what to do"? Or do you just think that anything and everything now they tell you is a lie? How do we believe them?
Well, I made my bones more or less in narcotics and robbery. And so nobody's ever guilty. You know that. I mean, it wasn't me, it wasn't me. And then you throw out the evidence, you break, you have, and a lot of times they'll break down and tell you the truth. So as far as you can't believe another thing they say, that's not necessarily true. I don't expect, if I was to ask somebody, hey, did you just rob that bank up on First and Elm? And they, no, I don't expect them to say, yes, yeah, you got me. I don't expect that. So, there's sometimes these lies are just so outrageous from the get-go, but you're also dealing with the dynamic. Those were the two offenders' parents. It wasn't a stranger in a bar, these are the two parents there, and it wasn't one gunshot each. This was a slaughter. And later on you hear more and more things that come out. I would love to see something to get them out if it shows it wasn't them. Or there's proof there, not speculation from a letter that nobody can really attest to. Yeah, that's fine. I'm not hearing that. were nebulous in that letter when it was written, who got it. You can't talk to the cousin anymore, Mr. Cano. And so it's very easy to put it on somebody when they're not around. The worst thing in the world, one of the worst things, is accusations, false accusations, because it can't be proven. But you know what? For the person that's getting blamed for something, it can't be disproven either. It's very nebulous, and that's put you in a very bad position. I don't know. I mean, people, those type of lies right off the bat. Do you believe other things they say? To your question, yeah. Sometimes when there's facts to bear it out, there's just certain times you don't expect people to tell the truth right off the bat. Some people do.
Yeah. And for me, having spent the majority of my career in investigations, I very seldom expected anyone to tell me the truth, right? When I was interviewing them, as far as being a defendant or a subject of an incident or a case, right? Whether it was minor, major person crime. I think that's where I believe, and I strongly hold to this, that's where the investigative work, detailed investigative work comes in. That paints a picture. I always questioned whenever I had a subject come out and confess. I always questioned the confession. And thank God I would go back and my teams would go back and we would always look at the entirety of the case, the totality of the evidence in order to paint a picture. But yeah, there's always reservations as to why or can you trust someone who you're questioning? And I'll tell you why, because it's human nature to try to defend ourselves. Even when we get caught with our hand in the cookie jar, as they say, we generally tend to, throw some level of exculpatory statement, self-serving statement. In this particular case, when the officers arrived on the scene and during the course of the investigation, the crime scene investigation, where the two brothers were there, I believe there was no gun swab GSR, gun swab of the hand to see if there was any residue on them. So that was a missed opportunity. I think that we can go back and look at just about any investigation out there, and we can poke holes, especially those of us that have been there in that type of work and become very astute to the investigative process. But at the end of the day, I say let the facts of the case speak for themselves more so than the confessions of what the individual is going to tell you, because that will lead you to who done it, as they say. So my question to you guys at the end here is one last question: where does the case go from here? Where do you see this case going?
You have to see what Mr. Gascon's going to do. He talked about resentencing 300 people in his career, and only 4 reoffended. So he said, I get the feeling he's ultimately going to look at it and resentence or just cut the sentencing out right there and let them walk.
So what's to come and where do we go from here? As David suggests, it really is pivotal, this next step of DA Gascon. And what I heard recently directly from him in an interview was that he felt that 34 years was long enough and that he didn't necessarily think that they should be serving the entirety of their lives. So that he may have tipped the hat there. As long as the facts have been reviewed in totality, I am hopeful that the right decision for the criminal justice system will prevail.
On that note, why don't you tell us what you think? Drop us a line, share your opinions, share your thoughts. There's a lot to be talked about on this particular case. You can find us on all podcast platforms, major podcast platforms at Bets and Badges, or you can find us on the web, www.betsandbadges.com. Let us know, drop us a line. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Debbie Goodman. As always, pleasure. My co-host, David. Talk to you later, brother.